Herbert Hoover was the 31st President of the United States. He served from 1929 to 1933. Hoover had a reputation as a humanitarian earned during and after World War I when he rescued millions of Europeans from starvation. But his popularity faded when, as president, his administration could not alleviate widespread joblessness, homelessness, and hunger during the early years of the Great Depression. Herbert Clark Hoover, August 10, 1874 to October 20, 1964, mining engineer, humanitarian, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and 31st President of the United States, was the son of Jesse Hoover, a blacksmith, and Huldah Minthorn Hoover, a seamstress and recorded minister in the Society of Friends, Quakers. Hoover was born in West Branch, Iowa, where he enjoyed fishing in the local creek and working in his father's blacksmith shop. Hoover lived in Iowa only for the first decade of his life. Orphaned at 9 years old, he began an odyssey that would make him a multimillionaire, international humanitarian, Secretary of Commerce, and President of the United States. He left Iowa at age 11 in November 1885, bound for Oregon and the home of his maternal uncle, Henry Minthorn, who was a doctor and a school superintendent, and later, a real estate broker. Hoover lived with the Minthorns for 6 years. At 14, he left school to work as a clerk in his uncle's real estate business. 3 years later, having decided to pursue a career as a mining engineer, Hoover sought to resume his studies and applied to a new school, Leland Stanford Junior University, set to open in 1891. It was at Stanford that he made lifelong friends, found a mentor in Professor John Casper Branner, and met his future wife, Lou Henry. He was active in extracurricular activities, serving as student body treasurer and as manager of both the baseball and football teams. Hoover graduated from Stanford in 1895, and then made his fortune as an international mining engineer and financier over the next 2 decades. In 1914, Hoover was living in London when World War I broke out in Europe. Yearning for an opportunity for public service, he immediately organized assistance for American travelers who were fleeing the war. A few weeks later he established the Commission for Relief in Belgium to provide food for Belgian civilians trapped in the war zone. In 1917 the United States entered the war, and Hoover, now a famous humanitarian, returned stateside to be appointed by President Woodrow Wilson as the head of the new U.S. Food Administration. Under Hoover's leadership, the Food Administration dramatically increased farm production by influencing market prices with massive government purchasing, and appealed to the general public to voluntarily reduce consumption without resorting to rationing. When the war ended in 1918, Hoover returned to Europe as Director General of the American Relief Administration to distribute food and relief supplies throughout Europe. As a result of his humanitarianism, Hoover was widely admired in the United States and was sought by both political parties as a candidate for president in 1920. Hoover eventually declared himself a Republican and accepted President Warren Harding's invitation to serve as Secretary of Commerce. At the Department of Commerce, where he served through both the Harding and Coolidge administrations, he established a wide range of standards for manufactured products, campaigned against waste and inefficiency in industry, and encouraged the growth of new industries such as radio and aviation. He became one of the most prominent men in Washington, and his reputation as master of emergencies reached new heights in 1927, when he took charge of relief efforts following floods on the Mississippi River. President Herbert Hoover delivering the inaugural address, March 4, 1929. 31-1929-86. In 1928, when President Coolidge chose not to run for another term, Hoover easily won the Republican nomination despite never having held an elected office. In the November election, he defeated Alfred E. Smith, the Democratic governor of New York, in a landslide. As president, Hoover hoped to govern in the progressive tradition of Theodore Roosevelt. True to his dream, he devoted the first 8 months of his presidency to a variety of social, economic, and environmental reforms. After the stock market crash of October 1929, President Hoover sought to prevent panic from spreading throughout the economy. In November, he summoned business leaders to the White House and secured promises from them to maintain wages. Hoover ordered federal departments to speed up their construction projects as a way of creating jobs, and asked state governors to expand their public works projects. He requested Congress approve a $160 million tax cut while doubling spending for public buildings, dams, highways, and harbors. The president would not, however, provide direct federal relief to the unemployed. Economic conditions improved in early 1931 until a series of bank collapses in Europe sent new shockwaves through the American economy, leading to additional layoffs. President Hoover was criticized for almost every program he proposed. His public works projects, designed to create jobs, were characterized as wasteful government spending. His efforts to promote local relief programs and private charities, rather than asking Congress to create nationwide relief programs, were viewed as callous disregard for the unemployed. His programs proved inadequate, as the number of unemployed workers increased from 3 million in 1930 to 10 million in 1932. In January 1932, Hoover established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to make emergency loans to businesses and state relief programs. Hoover also persuaded Congress to establish federal home loan banks to help protect people from losing their homes. Despite signs of economic improvement, the president's political reputation as the master of emergencies plummeted in the face of rising unemployment. He nonetheless mounted a vigorous campaign for re-election in 1932 and traveled the country by train, defending his policies at every stop. But it came as no surprise to Hoover that he lost to Franklin D. Roosevelt in the general election. Hoover departed Washington with a heavy heart on March 4, 1933. Hoover devoted the next 12 years to writing books, speaking on issues of public concern, and serving as chairman of a number of philanthropic organizations. He became staunchly opposed to Roosevelt's New Deal policies. During World War II, Hoover remained on the sidelines, as Roosevelt refused to allow him to serve in a public role. In late May 1945, only 6 weeks after Roosevelt's death, Hoover met with President Harry Truman and the two men planned for the recovery of post-war Europe. In 1946, at Truman's request, Hoover traveled the world to provide the president with a personal assessment of world food needs. Hoover and Truman also joined forces in 1947 on a commission to reorganize the executive branch of the federal government. The commission's recommendations led to a streamlined, more efficient post-war government. Hoover later agreed to Dwight Eisenhower's request to chair a second Hoover Commission from 1953 to 1955, but he was frustrated by the president's apparent lack of support for the commission's recommendations. In addition to public service, Hoover devoted his post-presidential years to social causes such as the Boys Clubs of America and the Hoover Institution, a research center he had established on the Stanford campus in 1919. He also published more than 40 books during those years. Hoover's attention returned to Iowa late in the 1950s when he agreed to allow friends and associates to construct a presidential library near the site of his birthplace. Hoover insisted that the building be modest in size in accordance with scale of the other buildings in the community. The former president made his last visit to Iowa on August 10, 1962, to dedicate that building to the American people. Herbert Hoover died on October 20, 1964. On October 25, the body of Herbert Hoover was interred in a simple grave on an Iowa hill overlooking the cottage where he was born. Herbert Clark Hoover was born on August 10, 1874, in a two-room, whitewashed cottage built by his father in West Branch, Iowa, a small prairie town of just 265 people. The future president did not cross east of the Mississippi River until he was 22 years old. When Hoover was 6 years old, his father died of a heart attack while suffering a bout of pneumonia. A little more than 3 years later, Hoover's mother, Huldah, died from pneumonia and typhoid fever, which left young Bertie and his older brother and younger sister parentless. The three children were separated to live with Huldah's various relatives. When Hoover was 11, he was put on a westbound Union Pacific train to live with Huldah's brother John Minthorn in Newburgh, Oregon. In 1891, Hoover enrolled in the new West Coast University founded by industrialist Leland Stanford. While the future president failed Stanford's entrance examination, the professor who administered the test admired his remarkable keenness and admitted him conditionally. Hoover had so little money that at times he lived in the barracks housing construction workers building the university. Hoover served as financial manager for Stanford's football and baseball teams, won election as treasurer, and met his future wife, Lou Henry, in geology class. After graduating from Stanford in 1895 with a geology degree, Hoover took an engineering job with the British mining firm of Buick, Moring and Company. He traveled the world locating lucrative mineral deposits, and by the age of 27, he had become one of the firm's 4 partners. He left the company in 1908 and soon had profitable business interests on every continent except for Antarctica. The wealthy Hoover donated his presidential salary to charity. Although accused by some of reacting callously to the millions of Americans forced onto bread lines during the Great Depression, Hoover was recognized around the world as such a great humanitarian that he was nominated 5 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. After Hoover spearheaded a private effort to ensure the safe return of 120,000 American tourists stranded in Europe at the outbreak of World War I, the United States government recruited him to deliver food to neutral Belgium, where 7 million people faced starvation. Later Hoover headed the American Relief Administration, which delivered food to tens of millions of people in more than 20 war-torn countries. Between 1921 and 1923, the aid he directed to the famine-stricken Soviet Union fed more than 15 million people daily. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed, he declared to opponents who accused him of aiding communism. Public opinion of Hoover was so high following his humanitarian work during World War I that both Republicans and Democrats courted him as a presidential candidate in 1920. "He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States," wrote Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. There could not be a better one. 12 years later, the two men became bitter foes for the presidency as Roosevelt defeated Hoover in a landslide. While serving as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge, Hoover's voice and image were transmitted live in the first American demonstration of television on April 7, 1927. Hoover never held elective office until he won the 1928 presidential campaign. Before becoming the 31st president, Hoover had been appointed to his previous government positions. To keep Hoover physically fit, White House physician Admiral Joel T. Boone developed a game played by the president and his staff each morning on the south lawn of the White House in which teams of 2 to 4 players threw a 6-pound medicine ball over an 8-foot-high net. Dubbed Hoover Ball by a New York Times reporter in 1931, the sport was played on a court similar to tennis and scored the same, with the exception being that the ball was thrown instead of hit with a racket. It required less skill than tennis, was faster and more vigorous, and therefore gave more exercise in a short time, Hoover wrote in his memoirs. A National Hoover Ball Championship is held in Hoover's birthplace of West Branch, Iowa, each year. The massive dam on the Colorado River that now bears Hoover's name was approved when he was Secretary of Commerce and was under construction while he was president. While the engineering marvel was originally proposed to be called Hoover Dam, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes claimed Hoover had very little to do with the dam and changed its official name to Boulder Dam. When Roosevelt dedicated the dam on September 30, 1935, the administration did not invite Hoover to the ceremony and the president did not even mention his predecessor in his speech. In 1947, President Harry Truman signed a law that restored the original name Hoover Dam. Thank you for watching this video.